Before anyone ever noticed his silence, before the pauses between albums became intentional and the disappearances hardened into legend, there was a single night in London when a door stayed ajar longer than it should have, and two men famous for noise chose quiet instead. This is the beginning of that night. And if you believe the most powerful stories are the ones told in whispers instead of headlines, take a second to like and subscribe, because this story lives in that space. It was late in 1966, London wrapped in damp air and yellow streetlight, the kind of night where the city felt bruised but awake, and John Lennon was walking alone with no plan other than to get away from the rooms he'd just left behind. Rooms full of laughter that didn't reach the eyes, questions he was tired of answering, men congratulating him for things that no longer felt like achievements. He'd slipped out of an industry dinner without explanation, coat pulled tight, hands buried in his pockets, trying to remember what it felt like to exist without an audience. Fame had started to feel less like flight and more like gravity, pressing down on him from all sides. Somewhere near a narrow side street, John slowed when he heard a sound that didn't belong to the night, a voice drifting from an upper floor above a closed cafe, unfinished and unguarded. It wasn't a song meant to be heard. It was humming that kept breaking off, a melody started and abandoned, followed by silence and a sharp breath, then another attempt. John stopped completely. He knew that voice instantly. Bob Dylan. But not the Dylan of stages and microphones. This was raw, almost fragile, like someone trying to hold themselves together by sound alone. John stood there longer than he meant to, staring up at the dark window, feeling that uneasy pull of recognition. Because when you hear someone else coming undone, it forces you to confront your own fractures. He could have walked on. He nearly did. Instead, he turned back, climbed the narrow stairwell that smelled of old wood and smoke, and knocked softly. When the door opened, Bob Dylan stood there looking smaller than the world imagined him. Hair uncombed, eyes hollow, a cigarette burned nearly to the filter between his fingers. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Bob stepped aside, and John entered, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality. The room was dim, lit by a single lamp. Papers were scattered across the floor, lyrics half-written and crossed out, as if they'd failed some private test. A guitar leaned against the wall, untouched. This wasn't a space curated by handlers or managers. It was a temporary refuge for a man who didn't know where to stand anymore. Bob sat on the floor without ceremony, staring at the pages. "Can't get it to work," he said, voice low, almost embarrassed. John leaned against the wall, unsure which version of himself to use. The sharp one, the funny one, the deflecting one. None of them felt right. "Haven't even picked up the guitar," John said. Bob let out a short laugh that held no humor. "What's the point?" That question filled the room. Outside, a car hissed past on wet pavement, a reminder that the world kept moving regardless. Bob picked up a page, read a line, then crumpled it with sudden frustration. "They want me to be something," he said. "Everywhere I go. Like I owe them the version of me they remember." John slid down the wall until he was sitting opposite him. "They don't want change," he said quietly. "They want repetition." Bob finally looked up, eyes tired but sharp. "You ever think about stopping? Not changing direction. Not slowing down. Stopping." John hesitated, the truth heavy. "Every day," he admitted. Bob nodded, as if that settled something. The air felt thick, intimate, honest in a way neither was used to. "After the crash," Bob said, staring at the floor, "everyone thought I disappeared on purpose. Truth is, I didn't know how to come back." He gestured at the scattered pages. "Feels like I'm pretending to be myself." John understood that terror, the fear of becoming a parody while still alive. He wanted to offer wisdom, but all he managed was, "You don't have to be brilliant tonight." Bob's shoulders dropped slightly, like he'd been holding them up for weeks. They sat there in silence. Two men turned into symbols too early, listening to the building settle around them. John noticed Bob's hands shaking, not dramatically, just enough to be real. "London's too loud," Bob said. John nodded. "So is everything else." Neither of them knew it yet, but this quiet, unrecorded moment, this shared exhaustion, was the first crack in a night that would leave no witnesses, no photos, and no proof. Only the faint imprint of honesty on everything that followed. By the time the silence settled properly between them, it had stopped feeling awkward and started feeling necessary. like the quiet you need after something breaks, but before you decide whether to fix it or leave it broken. Bob was still on the floor, back against the wall now, cigarette forgotten and burning itself out in the ashtray, while John sat opposite him, knees drawn up, glasses off, his face stripped of the practiced expressions people expected. The room smelled stale, smoke, paper, exhaustion, and it felt less like a hotel room than a waiting area between lives. Bob was the one who spoke first, not looking up, his voice flatter than before. "Everyone thinks the crash scared me," he said. "Like I hit the ground and suddenly wanted peace and quiet." He let out a dry breath. "Truth is, it wasn't the road that scared me. It was waking up and realizing I didn't miss any of it." John didn't interrupt. He'd learned, the hard way, that moments like this collapse if you rush them. Bob continued, words coming slowly now, as if dragged out of somewhere deep and reluctant. "I thought if I stepped away, I'd hear something again. Something real. But all I hear is noise. My own voice trying to sound like it used to." He kicked at one of the crumpled pages. "Feels like a trick." John nodded, because he knew exactly what that felt like. The moment when your instincts start lying to you. When applause teaches you the wrong lessons. "They don't give you time to change," John said. "Soon as you do, they call it betrayal." Bob snorted softly. "We're genius. Depends how it sells." That made John smile, briefly, but it didn't last. The truth underneath was too heavy. John leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't know who I am without the noise," he admitted, surprising himself with how easily it came out. "Everywhere I go, they're shouting my name like it belongs to them. Sometimes I think if it all stopped tomorrow, I'd disappear with it." Bob looked at him then, really looked, as if reassessing the man across from him. "Funny," he said. "I disappeared and found out I was still trapped." They sat with that for a while, two different routes to the same cage. Bob rubbed his face, dragging his hands down slowly. "You ever get scared," he asked, "that if you tell the truth, it won't fit the song anymore?" John didn't answer right away. He thought about the notebooks hidden away, the lyrics too personal to share, the version of himself that never made it onto vinyl. "All the time," he said finally. "That's usually how I know it's true." Bob let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "That's the problem," he said. "Truth doesn't behave. Doesn't sit where you tell it." He reached for the guitar at last, not to play it, just to steady himself, resting his hand on the worn wood. "They want answers," he continued. "Big ones. Political ones. Poetic ones. But half the time, I don't even know how I feel when I wake up." His voice wavered then, just slightly, enough for John to notice. Bob turned his head away, jaw tightening, embarrassed by the slip. John didn't comment on it. He understood the unspoken rule. You don't point out the moment someone almost breaks. You let it pass. Instead, John said something simpler, something truer. "You're allowed to not know." Bob froze. The words hung there, unchallenged. "You're allowed to be wrong," John went on. "You're allowed to write rubbish. You're allowed to stop for a bit." Bob shook his head faintly. "They won't forgive that." John shrugged. "They don't have to. You do." That landed. Bob closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the idea physically. When he opened them again, they were glassy, but steadier. "Nobody ever says that," he murmured. "They just tell me what comes next." Outside, somewhere far below, a siren wailed and faded. Time felt suspended, like dawn was waiting for permission to arrive. Bob leaned back, against the wall. "You know what scares me most?" he asked. "That I'll keep going just because I'm afraid to stop. That one day I'll wake up and realize I didn't choose any of it." John felt that fear like a mirror. "Choice is a dangerous thing," he said. "Soon as you realize you have it, you're responsible for what you do with it." Bob nodded slowly. The room grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not heavy, not suffocating. Something had loosened. Bob glanced at the scattered pages one last time, then deliberately pushed them aside. "Not tonight," he said, more to himself than to John. John stood, stretching stiff legs, and for a moment he looked every bit like a man who didn't know how to leave without breaking the spell. "You're not alone in this," he said finally. Bob met his eyes. "Neither are you." They didn't shake hands. They didn't make plans. Some understandings don't need structure. When John opened the door, the hallway light spilled in, thin and pale, the first hint of morning. As he stepped out, he paused. "Get some sleep," he said. Bob nodded. The door closed softly, and the world resumed its noise. But inside that room, something had shifted, quietly, permanently, in a way neither of them would ever explain to anyone else. Morning came without ceremony, the way it always does after a long night that feels bigger than the day waiting on the other side of it. The light crept in through the thin curtains, pale and unforgiving, revealing the room exactly as it was. Papers on the floor, the guitar against the wall, the quiet aftermath of something important that hadn't made a sound when it happened. Bob sat alone now, awake but still, listening to the city reassemble itself outside. Traffic returned. Voices rose. Somewhere, someone left. The world was already moving on, unaware that anything had almost stopped. He didn't reach for the guitar. He didn't reach for the pages. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the urge to force anything into shape. What John had said lingered, not as advice, but as permission. You're allowed to stop. Not forever, just long enough to breathe. When Bob finally stood, his movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were learning how to occupy his body again. Down the street, John Lennon was already walking, hands in his pockets, glasses back on, blending into the ordinary in a way fame rarely allowed him. He didn't look back at the building. He didn't need to. The night had done its work. Neither of them spoke about it later. No interviews hinted at it. No lyrics named it outright. But something subtle followed them both, like a recalibration. Dylan would retreat further, choosing distance over spectacle, control over chaos. Lennon's writing would turn sharper, more personal, less interested in pleasing anyone who wasn't listening closely. Critics would analyze the shifts for decades, searching for explanations in politics, drugs, movements, eras, never knowing the truth was quieter than all of that. It lived in a small London room where two men, briefly stripped of myth, chose honesty over performance. There were no witnesses, no proof, and no need for either. Some moments aren't meant to be remembered publicly. They exist to remind the people inside them that they're still human. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.